Dark fantasy is one of the most popular subgenres of all time, and it's a genre older than just about everyone watching this video. It's a genre that's intertwined with fiction and generally loved by the masses, and for good reason. It's a genre birthed from fantasy that would usually combine horror and supernatural with standard fantasy elements. The themes are usually darker, more mature, and sometimes extremely bleak, with some even exploring more ambiguous themes. It would feature things such as vampires, undead beings, haunted forests, decaying castles, and ruins of a place that used to be bustling with life years ago. It's a genre that would perfectly blend both dread and mystery within its core essence. It would even have elements of psychological horror with how it would explore themes of madness and despair within its setting and characters. The first Dark Souls is a classic example of dark fantasy done right, as everything can be described as none other than hopeless, with nihilism also being a big part of dark fantasy, as sometimes the world is just too much for the characters. This would be heavily explored in something like Berserk, which is one of the most popular manga of all time, known for its harsh setting which takes a massive toll on our characters and protagonists, where the main character Guts would experience severe trauma and emotional torment throughout his story from things such as extreme violence and loss and betrayal. Another good piece would be a movie called Pan's Labyrinth, which takes place in Francois, Spain, shortly after the Spanish Civil War. It would not only portray the world in a cold and bleak visual style, but also the oppressive nature of fascism through authoritarian brutality. But honestly, I am getting a bit ahead of myself. To fully understand and appreciate dark fantasy, we have to go back to one of the earliest popularized forms of dark fantasy, which would be none other than the Italian poem The Divine Comedy by Dante Alighieri. This was released in 1306 and completed around 1321, and follows a protagonist named Dante who was lost in a forest and rescued by a man named Virgil, who would also serve as his guide. Dante was depicted with red clothing, and Virgil was depicted with blue clothing, which is very interesting as there is a more modern piece of media following two characters with the same name. The story would follow them delving deeper into the afterlife, and more specifically the 9 circles of hell, with each representing a different sin and its corresponding punishment. The first stage would actually be a little story that you might have heard before, being Dante's Inferno. Dante's Inferno would be the first act of the Divine Comedy, and it's the most famous section leading into this story. The second act would follow Purgatory, with Dante and Virgil climbing the mountains of Purgatory where their souls will be cleansed of their sins before they can enter heaven. Then the last act would follow Paradise, where Dante would be guided by a character named Beatrice through the spheres of heaven to reach the ultimate vision of God. But honestly, the most interesting and creative part of this story might have been Dante's Inferno, because that is the part that everyone knows the story for. It felt like a very personal journey, given that the work is semi-autobiographical, with Dante using his own spiritual crisis as the starting point of the narrative. And centuries later, people still can't get enough of the story, because Dante's Inferno would be brought back as a really cool character action game in 2010, which would follow the events of the story, but would slightly change some events, like making Dante a Templar knight who had his wife Beatrice be murdered and her soul taken by Lucifer. Then Dante would have to go to hell to rescue her, unlike the source material where Dante was a poet and was guided by Virgil, having his journey through hell be more spiritual rather than vindictive. Outside of the Divine Comedy, there would also be some great literature like A Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin, and a lot of the work from H.P. Lovecraft. Dark fantasy wouldn't get its big boom for a good while, and people were more interested in other genres like poetry and religion for the 17th century, and space in the future for the 20th century. Impactful movies like Excalibur, Labyrinth, The Dark Crystal, Dragon Slayer, Deathstalker, Beastmaker Conquest, Red Sonja, and Return to Oz are some of the dark fantasy movies to come out and leave a heavy impact to the genre. This was when dark fantasy would start peaking and become more normalized. It would also get its big boom within the 80s to the 2000s, and in a time where classic shonen anime and manga was becoming more and more mainstream and popular, and Western media were focusing more on action and science fiction, there was one story that would come out that would be so atmospherically twisted with its themes and were darker than literally anything releasing at the time. This would be the manga/anime of Berserk. I've already mentioned Berserk before in the video, but I really just want to explain why this is one of the best dark fantasy pieces ever created. Berserk was created in 1988 by Kentaro Miura in his early 20s, and it started out as a 48-page prototype before becoming its own thing in 1989. Miura was heavily influenced by Western literature and medieval history, alongside classic horror films, which definitely influenced the dark atmosphere of Berserk. Conan the Barbarian was one Western film that influenced Miura, as it had themes of of struggle, ambition, and aspects of a human condition in mind. I'm also like 90% sure that these designs were used for Sega's Golden Axe in 1989. Alright, yeah, I was right. There's no way Axe Battler wasn't heavily influenced by this guy. With the main character of Berserk being Guts, Miura designed Guts as a deeply flawed warrior who embodies the themes of survival and struggle, and also wanted him to be both relatable but larger than life, and overall a character who would overcome his odds with sheer determination. Berserk, also being heavily inspired by medieval fantasy alongside its dark fantasy elements, would fuse the two seamlessly, creating one of the best atmospheres of all time. There are knights, castles, mercenaries, and even political power struggles alongside supernatural forces, monsters, demons, and apostles. Medieval combat on its own is already extremely gritty, so paired with some of the concepts like the Eclipse, one of the most iconic moments in Berserk, would be classified as nothing short of existential horror. Having a protagonist Guts have someone close to him essentially sacrifice the people around him in a scene that I don't even think I can really show in the video. Guts being a former mercenary and skilled swordsman, he would have his journey become defined by his battles against supernatural forces, but also a battle against himself, where he finds himself consumed by anger and revenge and would constantly be fighting his inner turmoil. Struggling with identity is a pretty common trope for dark fantasy protagonists. Having them question who they are and what their purpose is a common act for the main characters to go through at some point in their journey. But it hits even harder for something like Berserk because it's extremely rare for Guts to ever be at peace. Even something like seeing him smile is few and far between, and it doesn't help with how isolated he usually is. Guts embodies what it means to be a dark fantasy protagonist, and while flawed, he is still loved for who he is and for what he portrays and fights for. A lot of the time, anti-heroes are the popular choice for protagonists within this genre, as it makes the most sense. Kain is a protagonist from a series you probably have never heard of called Legacy of Kain, where our protagonist starts off as a noble man only to later embrace the darker sides of himself. Not necessarily becoming a villain, but someone who would end up struggling with their own moral ambiguity and question themselves on whether what they're doing is right or not. Being a character who is destined as a sacrificial figure due to his loss of humanity, he would choose to instead carve out his own path, showing that he values his free will more than his destined fate. I don't want to get too in-depth with this because I really do advise people to check out these games as they are amazing and underrated gems. But Kain's flaws would be central to his identity and the series, and he would possess both protective and destructive qualities, which makes him so interesting. And like Guts from Berserk, both of these protagonists would be defined by their flaws and mental struggles, even if they can be pretty different. But what exactly made people want to watch Berserk? Berserk was definitely an odd one compared to everything else that was coming out at the time, right? Well, outside of the fantastic storytelling, cover art, and manga panel details, Berserk was very new. Again, dark fantasy itself isn't exactly new, but for its time, everything mainstream that was coming out were a lot lighter, and if they dealt with fantasy, it would be different kinds of fantasy, but nothing like this. There was a growing shift around the 1990s where people wanted more darker themes in media. People wanted something with some depth and complexity. It broke away from your traditional hero story where good and bad is black and white. Guts isn't no Goku or Spider-Man. He's a deeply flawed individual who struggles and fails but finds the will within him to continue going. His motivations can even be a little warped at times, leaving him to be an extremely complex and morally gray character. He's the epitome of ain't shit to smile about. And you would see this continue very prominently throughout the years as people started to love anti-heroes. Dante from the Devil May Cry series is nowhere near as unhinged as Guts, but he would be another loved anti-hero who would be classified as morally gray, as well as someone like Deadpool, but that would lead into another topic on its own. Berserk would go on to inspire games like Castlevania, Blasphemous, Devil May Cry, Shadow of the Colossus, and of course Dark Souls. That big sword that Guts carries around everywhere would mark the beginning of cool protagonists casually wielding a sword, sometimes as big as their body. From Berserk becoming a worldwide success, elements of dark fantasy would be almost everywhere in gaming, inspiring so much amazing franchises that people just couldn't get enough of dark themes with morally gray characters. And this was around the 2000s where everything was getting edgier and game developers were becoming more and more interested in darker themes. But Berserk was only the beginning, and I want to zero in on one franchise that really helped grow the subgenre into the mainstream eye. And that franchise would have to be none other than Dark Souls. Dark Souls was created from the company FromSoft and directed by Hidetaka Miyazaki. But before we had Dark Souls, FromSoft had another game called Demon Souls, which released in 2009 on the PS3 to very high reviews. Demon Souls would be one of the first games to really popularize dark fantasy into the video game space. And it was also a combo of that medieval dark fantasy that I love so much. It painted itself as mysterious and dangerous with some really scary designs for its time. The muted color palette and oppressive atmosphere also did really well at selling this place as dangerous and bleak. Demon Souls would include a more visual approach to its storytelling instead of following a more consistent narrative with cutscenes and easy to follow plot lines. One of my favorites would be the fog that more so represents the looming darkness, and the fire that represents destruction but also a flicker of hope. Demon Souls unfortunately was really hard to advertise properly, but ended up becoming a sleeper hit, which led to Miyazaki becoming more motivated to create something that would more so expand on the concepts left in Demon Souls, and this led to the first Dark Souls in 2011. Here the franchise would grow into what is one of the most well-known franchises to date. Dark Souls would continue with the medieval dark fantasy that they started in Demon Souls, and would go all in on its environmental storytelling and heavily expand on its world building. Lordran is filled with ancient legends, deities, and mythical figures with scenery that makes you feel like the world is on the verge of collapsing. In Dark Souls, there's a very big emphasis on the idea of going hollow, which would be losing yourself and becoming a soulless and mindless undead being. This would only happen when a character would lose hope and meaning in life, which is extremely common given that you are fighting the existential struggle of meaninglessness. You would have NPCs around you who have a strong sense of direction slowly lose themselves and become hollow as they face the harsh world that they live in. For others, they would become hollow by achieving their goals, and others would become hollow by realizing that they would never achieve their goal. And some of them are really heartbreaking. Being strong characters who have a bright outlook for such a dark world become soulless and hostile to anything that moves. The way the game would portray enemies and bosses would be fantastic as well. They aren't portrayed as just the bad guy that you have to beat up, but more so beings who have been corrupted due to the world's defiled state. Artorias the Abyss Walker is one fight that is perfect for this, as he would perfectly embody the themes of this game, being corruption and finding meaning and purpose to stay alive. Artorias was the fourth knight of Gwyn, who is known as the Lord of Sunlight, who also happens to be the final boss of the game. The four knights were some of Gwyn's most trusted and powerful warriors. One day something called the Abyss started to spread throughout their lands, so Artorias was sent by Gwyn to stop the spread. Artorias took his companion, being Great Wolf Sif, another amazing boss of this game. Artorias would fight off the creatures of the Abyss alongside Sif, but eventually there came to be too much to fight. Overwhelmed by darkness, Artorias' arm would become shattered in combat, and he would become corrupted by the Abyss. Being the most noble knight of Gwyn, he would become the same thing he despised and sought to destroy. While becoming corrupted, he would still use his shield to protect Sif, and entrusted him to protect his grave and watch the Abyss, showing that even while being corrupted, his humanity would still stay strong. Now when coming across him in-game, it's a completely different story. Artorias is nothing but a shadow of his former self, and in the cutscene where you meet him, he comes off as haunting and intimidating, as if everything that you've heard about him up to now was nothing but a lie. From how he looks, to how he moves, to how he even sounds mid-fight, putting him down here would be exactly what he would want, since he has been turned into the same darkness that he fought against. Artorias wouldn't be hollowed in this state, since that would mean that his humanity would be gone, but rather maddened and corrupted, which would explain his grotesque actions and appearance. Even the way he holds his sword would be very interesting. Hold up, is that the Guts pose? I almost forgot to mention just how much of Guts' inspiration went into creating Artorias. Artorias, being one of the only humanoid bosses in Dark Souls, would actually be taking heavy inspiration from Guts, and Artorias would become consumed by darkness as he fights against it, just as Guts would become consumed by the Berserker armor. Volume 28 of Berserk would actually be very closely represented in the Dark Souls Prepare to Die cover as well. And small side note, but this is something that would continue throughout the games heavily. But this is just one of the many amazing battles and stories of Dark Souls, and I haven't even gotten into the world building of Lordran or Honor Londo. I believe that Artorias is one of the best ones to mention for this game, as it's extremely compelling, emotional, and just downright interesting. And defeating him wouldn't lead into major satisfaction, as Artorias' unfortunate transformation wasn't intentional. This is a story of Dark Souls that just teaches you that there are no true heroes in this game, only survivors in a decaying world. A lot of these bosses boss fights would happen to be the player being thrusted into morally unclear scenarios where defeating the next roadblock doesn't exactly lead into clear or noble outcomes, instead just survival. And even something as small as the brutal difficulty of Dark Souls would serve to further push this game's message. But outside of the amazing storylines and symbolism, Dark Souls' biggest metaphor would be within its gameplay. The difficulty of Dark Souls completely mirrors the world that it portrays, constantly putting up the player to fight against overwhelming odds and struggle to stay alive. Dying is of course a major focal point for this game and series, as everything is out to get you, and some of it is pretty damn unfair. To me, it would remind us of the usual dark fantasy protagonists who would always struggle but overcome their odds. With the player's strong endurance, it would reflect the grim determination of our dark fantasy protagonists. But in Dark Souls, death is one of the most important parts of the experience, as constantly dying and resurrecting as an undead would reinforce the game's messages of life, death, and rebirth, which would align itself with the more nihilistic tones of dark fantasy where loss and death are inevitable. This was also one of the games that had the hardest dual boss combos, which is more common today. As if one of these behemoths aren't enough, Ornstein and Smo would be enough for some to really question whether the suffering is worth it. The dual boss would be infamous for its difficulty, having one of them be fast and nimble, being Ornstein, and the other being slower but much more hard-hitting, being Smo. With such a hard battle, 2 close knights would be defeated, and one of which was a noble knight of Gwyn. But dying so consistently, especially for those that are on their first playthrough, reinforces the never-ending cycle this game describes. It's symbolic of what dark fantasy portrays on a broader scale, where no victory is permanent and no defeat is final. Despite this game being slightly rough around the edges on release in terms of visuals and gameplay, people wanted to stick around for the end because of the immersive lore, extremely challenging fights, and genuine satisfaction of finding secrets and progressing. Dark Souls being one of the best games to come out and revitalize the genre, it wouldn't be the only one, because The Elder Scrolls Skyrim would be released in the same year on November 11th, 2011. This would be another iconic gem that would last heavily throughout the years, being more of a blend of something called high fantasy with dark fantasy elements and tones. It's something that had a huge impact on the generation. High fantasy is another subgenre of fantasy where it would include magical realms, fantasy creatures, and sometimes some more bizarre or strange technology. It would usually deal with world-threatening forces, and the fate of the world would be left in the hands of the protagonist. Basically the kind of stuff that looks like this. Skyrim would have your classic dark fantasy stuff like vampires, dungeons, necromancers, but also include more mature themes such as civil war, Nordic mythology, and its different factions such as the Imperials and the Stormlocks, adding a layer of political warfare. Dark fantasy works so well with this medium because of how interactive games can be, with Skyrim being one of the best open world games to date, and also having such a meticulous level of detail within its story and setting. This would really be one of the first games to let the player live out their fantasy to this extent, having things such as becoming a strong mage or warrior with weapons and masteries of your choice, to start your own family and being in a relationship, all within this fantasized world. Skyrim would also work so well with dark fantasy that it would slightly tap into the more horror side of it all within a lot of its scenery, lore, and quest lines. The Skyrim dungeons would be a great example of this, as they were created with the idea of claustrophobia in mind, having dim lighting and even sudden ambushes that can catch you off guard. A lot of the side quests would also be more horror themed and would have some sort of scary element to it, making it more memorable in my opinion. House of Horrors and the Dark Brotherhood would be great examples of this, as they are both pretty popular side quests within the games, which feature rituals, undead, and dark and dusty crypts. Daedric quests would also be another great example of this, as they would force the player to engage with the darker side of the world, and through this you would confront your own sense of morality. It would immerse you in the unsettling atmosphere, as its themes of madness, domination, and forbidden power, while also having some good variety within the quests as well. Going from fighting in an arena to exploration or puzzle solving, Skyrim's influence did wonder for fantasy games, and also left an amazing blueprint on how people can blend dark fantasy with something other than medieval fantasy. It also did well for some people getting into the high fantasy genre, as it was, and in some ways still is, one of the best open world games ever created. The only other big high fantasy games were Fable, some of the original Final Fantasy, World of Warcraft, Dragon Age Origins, and some other games, but none of them would ever be brought to the mainstream like this, and offer so much engagement within its fantasy setting. setting. With Skyrim selling over 7 million units within its first week and being ported to literally anything you can imagine, people were starting to love the fantasy approach within their games. Thanks to both Skyrim and Dark Souls both releasing in the same year and kind of starting another fantasy boom within the 2010s, it would lead to a lot of gems being released around the dark fantasy aesthetic soon after. Games that would fall under the dark fantasy aesthetic did wonders for the time, as gaming was growing to a much bigger medium than before. And with how expansive games were becoming, it would be very easy to find yourself completely immersed into the world of these games. Some great games that I didn't mention were Dragon's Dogma 1, Diablo 3, and some of my personal favorites being the Shin Megami Tensei games. Dragon's Dogma 1 being extremely unique for the time that it came out, and also having some really interesting and cool gameplay mechanics. It would go on for a sequel in March of 2024 to mediocre reviews. And Diablo 3 having your classic dark fantasy setting, but in such a unique visual art style, with a plot revolving around a never-ending holy war and not being afraid to show lots of ritualistic and cultist imagery. This would also go on for a sequel in January 2024. And SMT games being games that I've been into for a solid while now, having games featuring a plethora of ideas from demonology and a strong sense of isolation to post-apocalyptic settings, and heavy doses of symbolism, and all of it sprinkled with philosophical depth within every single corner. Through games, dark fantasy was able to grow and expand exponentially and become more of a normalized genre within fiction. It pushed the boundaries for what games can achieve and allowed for such uncommon and often uncomfortable themes to be displayed in an interactive form that is both compelling and immersive. Like, I genuinely think that there's just something so compelling and different in terms of the gaming side of this genre, solely because it allows you to carve out your own story and take these themes and aesthetics at your own pace. Once again, even for something like Dark Souls, which is not an open world game like Skyrim, allows you to dissect the lore and engage in the setting at your own pace. With something like Skyrim, for example, it would be so engaging for so many people simply because there's no limitation on how you want to handle and engage with the story and themes of this game. But how is dark fantasy perceived today? And is it something that is still popularized like it was back then? Well, kind of. Fantasy as a genre has grown a lot, and other subgenres such as high fantasy, low fantasy, steampunk fantasy, etc. has grown bigger than dark fantasy in some regards, alongside other genres becoming more and more popular as well. But dark fantasy as a subgenre always just hit the hardest in my opinion. Darker moods and darker endings has always hit harder for me because of the grittiness and tragic reality that they offer, having mostly no good answer with no clear direction on how to move forward in some stories, even having the protagonist follow certain actions that they may or may not be seen as moral or right. But even if dark fantasy isn't as popular as it was during its peaks, it's still highly regarded and remembered. Some of the most profound and favorable works are a part of the dark fantasy subgenre, and for good reason. Everything from the story to the themes to the general aesthetics and bleak perspectives on life as they know it fits extremely well, and some tell very important stories that we don't necessarily get too often. Though in recent times, people have been mass creating AI renditions of their favorite shows, movies, or games under dark fantasy aesthetics, and in no way am I supporting AI art, but as a concept, they are pretty impressive. But what this tells me is that we just desperately need more dark fantasy aesthetics and creations within our media. Final Fantasy 16 would even be switching it up a bit and incorporating lots of dark fantasy elements in their game, in hopes to spice up the formula that hasn't been drastically changed in years. It's a pretty powerful genre that deals with these themes in ways other genres avoid, and holds significant cultural relevance that would be pretty hard to forget, all while tackling themes like human nature in some of the most raw fashion I've ever seen. In short, dark fantasy is absolute peak fantasy.
You know, there's no need for you to worry yourself. It was for my own sake that I did all that. It wasn't for you in particular. It's just my nature. I'd rather fight with my sword than run away, that's all.
So that's the only reason? You fought 100 men because it's not in your nature to run away.
Yeah, pretty much.